In the winter of 1883, a building crew unearthed a sealed chamber beneath the east wing of the long-abandoned Greystone Workhouse. Inside, 47 leather-bound ledgers, a rusted child's rattle, and a ledger that bore no name, only a single phrase carved into its spine. He sees what you do in the dark. There are buildings that were never meant to be remembered. Their bricks absorb not just moisture and soot, but memories too harrowing to speak aloud. Greystone Workhouse, nestled in the sodden hills of West Yorkshire, is one such place. It does not appear on modern maps. Its registry was formally expunged from public records in 1904, following a fire that was at the time declared accidental. But documents don't vanish by themselves. And fires don't start in locked underground vaults. The discovery that reopened Greystone's case came not from a historian, but from a demolition crew hired to repurpose the land for a community recreation center. When the east wing was torn down, a worker's shovel struck stone far deeper than the foundation should have reached. Beneath the rubble lay a bricked-over stairwell descending into the earth untouched by fire or weather. At its base, a small door of iron and oak bolted shut from the outside. They forced it open. Inside was a room no larger than a barn's feed stall, and yet it housed something that should never have been there, a forgotten ledger, untouched by time, wrapped in oilcloth tied with red twine. It was labeled only by a phrase etched in a child's handwriting, "He sees what you do in the dark." The contents would horrify even the most hardened historian. The ledger is not like the others discovered alongside it, where the official books recorded wages, punishments, food portions, and inmate rosters. This unnamed volume cataloged something far more chilling: the disappearances. It listed 92 names, most of them marked reassigned, medically transferred, or more cryptically returned to silence. The handwriting changed midway through from precise administrator's script to a shaky childlike scrawl. Some entries were accompanied by disturbing notes: cried too loud, would not eat again, eyes too old for 6. No death certificates, no burial records, no bodies. These names, untraceable in any census or parish registry, were not just lost. They were erased. In 1885, 2 years after the vault was sealed, a young reformist named Eleanor Whitcomb gave testimony to the House of Commons on the irregular treatment of inmates at northern charitable institutions. Her voice was quickly drowned out by louder political agendas. But her private diaries, archived by her granddaughter at the University of Manchester, tell a different story. And in those pages, the name Greystone appears again and again, crossed out, rewritten, underlined, almost as if she feared even writing it would call something forth. It is from Eleanor's journals, the unearthed ledgers, and a single surviving survivor's letter smuggled out in 1879 by a boy named Nathaniel that this investigation begins. This is not just a tale of a cruel workhouse. It is the story of what happens when the people meant to protect the forgotten become the ones who ensure they are never remembered. We were told it was God's mercy that brought them there, but I have come to believe it was something else entirely. The ones who built Greystone did not believe in redemption. They believed in silence. Eleanor Whitcomb, Private Diary, 1886. The first official mention of Greystone Workhouse appears not in a registry of charitable institutions, but in a land acquisition ledger from 1836 under the name St. Jude's Industrial Chapel. The deed was signed by 3 individuals: Father Archibald Crane of the Diocese of Leeds Bartholomew Quince, a cotton baron whose mills lined the River Calder, and Reverend Silas Marin, a lesser-known theologian excommunicated in 1832 for doctrinal irregularities involving suffering and atonement. They purchased 14 acres of moorland, unsuitable for farming, isolated from towns and flanked by marsh on one side and forest on the other, the perfect place to hide what must not be seen. By 1839, the site had transformed into a towering slate-roofed compound surrounded by 9-foot brick walls crowned with a wrought iron gate that read, "Labor purifies. Hunger redeems." Officially, Greystone was classified as a combined workhouse and moral correction facility under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. But unlike other workhouses, Greystone took in those other institutions, refused orphans with disabilities mothers declared unfit the mentally ill, former prostitutes and children born out of wedlock. In a time when salvation was reserved for the clean and compliant, Greystone became the final stop for the stained and unwanted. It had no windows facing outward, only inward. Reverend Silas Marin's theological writings, most of which were banned by the Church of England, offer a troubling insight into Greystone's founding philosophy. In one surviving pamphlet, A Doctrine of Hollow Vessels, he writes, "Suffering is the crucible by which the impure are either refined or reduced to ash. God is not a nurse, he is a furnace." This sentiment, extreme even by Victorian penitential standards, was foundational to Greystone's regimen. Inmate schedules included 14 hours of labored daily mandatory fasting on alternate days, and reflection vigils, solitary confinement in cold stone cells for up to 72 hours enforced in total darkness. What's more disturbing, however, are the records that are missing. According to the West Riding Council census of 1842, Greystone listed 214 inmates. By 1844, only 109 are accounted for. No transfers, no burials, no deaths logged. One entry from the unearthed ledger dated April 1843 lists a 6-year-old named Mary Elsbeth with a single notation, voice too wild, removed from chapel. The next page is blank, no signature, no further mention of Mary in any document, official or private, ever again. A chapel volunteer named Helen Forrester would later testify in a sealed affidavit that she saw a small girl with bandaged eyes being led through the laundry tunnels beneath the chapel at night. She was never asked to return. Her testimony was never made public. When Parliament began its inspection of northern poorhouses in 1851, Greystone was not on the list. It had by then voluntarily delisted itself as a state-run institution, claiming to operate under diocesan internal doctrine. This effectively exempted it from government oversight, turning it into a private ecclesiastical facility beyond the reach of law. And that is where the worst began. But it is also when someone inside began documenting it all, in pencil, on scraps, hidden in hymnals. We now believe the anonymous chronicler was a boy named Nathaniel Blythe, admitted at age 9. His later letter would become the single most damning artifact tied to Greystone's crimes. That letter is what we turn to next. There was a bell under the floor. They said not to speak of it. But some nights it rang. And when it rang, someone was always gone the next morning. Letter from Nathaniel Blythe, 1879. Nathaniel Blythe entered Greystone Workhouse on March 4, 1868, at the age of 9. His intake record still exists, though it is barely legible, now faded brittle water-stained. The reason for admittance is marked as mother deceased, father unknown. Child exhibits excess imagination. He was placed in Ward D, also known by staff as the still room. It was the ward for noisy ones. Unlike many other children Nathaniel could write, his mother had taught him letters in secret before her death. That gift would become both his salvation and the reason we know any of this at all, hidden in the margins of torn hymnals under the fraying lining of bunk mattresses and scrawled on the backs of unused ration slips Nathaniel wrote. Not to rebel, not to escape, but to remember. They take the ones who cry too long, the ones who scream when they sleep. The night sisters say they've gone to the garden. But the garden is cold. It smells of wet cloth and copper. Fragment page 3. Hidden Psalm. What Nathaniel called the garden would come up again and again in his writings, and in one chilling entry he drew it. A square room, underground, surrounded by bricks etched with tally marks, a basin in the middle, and behind it a rope. When archivists later examined Greystone's foundation schematics, they confirmed that there was no officially listed chamber beneath the central chapel. And yet, when excavation teams opened the sealed eastern wing in 1983, they found drainage pipes leading to nowhere, beginning directly beneath the chapel's stone floor. One pipe, capped and buried, contained a rusted metal fixture with a small clapper inside. A bell no larger than a child's fist. Nathaniel's most detailed account appears in a crumpled, smoke-damaged leaflet tucked between pages of the Book of Common Prayer. He never names himself directly, but scholars have matched his writing to the surviving letter smuggled out years later. That night entry reads March 12th. It rang again. Not the big bell in the tower, the little one, the one only we hear. Etta heard it too. She covered her ears. Said she saw a woman with no mouth standing by her bed. In the morning, Etta's bed was empty. No one would say her name. Sister Agnes smiled at breakfast. She only smiles when someone's gone. Of the 26 children assigned to Ward D in March of 1868, only 8 remained by September. No death records, no transfers, no mention at all except in Nathaniel's fragments. What makes his writings so critical is not just their content, but that they were hidden in plain sight for over a century. They were discovered accidentally during restoration of hymnals acquired by a private collector in 1976. It wasn't until 1981 that scholars matched the handwriting to Nathaniel's known letter preserved in the Whitcomb family archive. If you find this, please say their names. I remember them. I always will, even if no one else can. He signed only with an initial N. So, what happened to Nathaniel, according to a letter from Eleanor Whitcomb dated June 3, 1881? A boy, age perhaps 20, pale and fevered, came to the gate of my grandfather's parsonage. He carried no satchel, no money, and only one item of note, a page torn from the Gospel of Luke. On its back he had written 84 names. She said he handed it to her, then collapsed. He survived 3 days, fever, malnourishment. His final words were never recorded, but that list became the first known documentation of the missing children of Greystone, and the last evidence we have, before the fire. The children stopped speaking when she entered, not from fear, but from something else. Hope, perhaps. She was the only one who didn't wear gloves. Letter from Eleanor Whitcomb, 1882. Sister Magdalene joined the staff of Greystone Workhouse in the autumn of 1873. She was 27, recently transferred from a parish infirmary in Sussex after requesting assignment to a facility of greater spiritual urgency. Her arrival was noted in a rare surviving internal memo by Warden Harrow, who described her as young, eager, and dangerously sentimental. Her first weeks at Greystone were uneventful, at least on paper. She was placed in the infirmary wing responsible for tending minor injuries, administering tonics, and overseeing the chapel cleanse rota. But diaries recovered from her belongings tell a different story. In one early entry dated October 2, 1873, she wrote, "There is a smell in the stone corridors at dawn, not filth, not rot, but copper and something older. The children's eyes follow me, but they do not speak unless spoken to, and even then their answers feel rehearsed." One rule disturbed her more than any other: no direct contact with the inmates. Staff were issued gloves, thick black waxed fabric, and told not to touch any child or adult with bare skin. The justification, sanitary precaution. But Magdalene had worked in far worse places. She knew the difference between hygiene and fear. So she broke the rule. She treated a boy named Tomas, age 11, for a fever. His wrist had been bruised by restraints used during vigil correction. She held his hand as she applied salve. That same night, Tomas vanished. When Magdalene asked about him the next morning, she was told he'd been transferred to the Northern Sanatorium, but the workhouse had no such facility. She checked the infirmary log. His name had been crossed out not once, but twice with a different ink. In her diary, she wrote, "He screamed during the night. I heard it. So did the others." No one moved. But Sister Agnes came down with keys, and when she returned, her apron was wet. The more questions Magdalene asked, the more she was removed from duties. By December, she was reassigned to laundry inventory, but her silence was only surface deep. From the workroom attic where she sorted linens, she began mapping the underground layout based on steam pipe sounds and footfall patterns. She traced connections between the chapel, the infirmary, and an unused wing sealed behind brick. In January 1874, she wrote in code, "There are at least 2 corridors not shown on any map. One leads beneath the baptismal font. I saw Sister Agnes take a child down that way with no shoes. This was the first reference to what would later be known as the sub-chapel chamber, the alleged location of the garden described in Nathaniel Blythe's drawings. The last entry in Magdalene's journal is dated February 11, 1874. The bell rang again. I felt it this time not in my ears but in my teeth, like metal humming through the floor. 3 children gone, no explanation. I am no longer afraid. Tomorrow I will follow them. She did not return. Her official personnel file states only reassigned to St. Winifred's cloister. No further contact. But St. Winifred's, according to diocesan records, had closed 4 years earlier. Eleanor Whitcomb would later find Sister Magdalene's journal hidden inside a hollowed-out hymnal wrapped in linen behind a false panel in the workroom wall. Alongside it, a single child's glove, blood-stained. Too small for any staff member, he did not beat them. He did not shout. He simply looked at you until you agreed. And if you did not, well, then you were taken to the chapel for recalibration. Testimony from a former scullery maid, anonymous 1907. Warden Malcolm Harrow assumed control of Greystone Workhouse in 1859 following the sudden death of its former director, Father Leland Crane. Harrow was not a clergyman nor a physician. He was a theological disciplinarian, a self-taught man with a deep obsession for obedience as virtue and a fascination with mechanized silence. In a letter preserved in the diocesan archives, Harrow once wrote, "Sin begins with noise, questions, laughter, refusal. Silence is the gate through which sanctity walks." From the moment he arrived, changes swept through the workhouse. Spoken prayer was banned. All recitation was to be done internally in stillness. Mirrors were removed, considered vanity. Children who cried were not punished but separated. Sometimes for days. All chalkboards were painted black without text. Only gestures were allowed during instruction. And in the center of it all stood Harrow, a tall, angular man in a heavy wool coat who never raised his voice and never touched anyone. But when he entered the halls, footsteps stopped. Conversations died. Even the rats, it was said, grew quiet. But what truly sets Harrow apart from other 19th-century reformists was his doctrine, a privately printed manuscript called The Taming of Chaos. It was banned by the Church of England shortly after publication, and only 2 copies remain today, one in the British Library's restricted collection, the other recovered beneath Greystone, water-damaged and warped. In it, Harrow writes, "The human soul must be bent to shape like hot iron, and some must be broken entirely so others may learn." This was not discipline. This was design. The children's reassignments, the chapel vigils, the silent punishments, they were all part of a long orchestrated pattern. And yet Harrow kept meticulous public records, all of which appeared lawful and pious. His manipulation was elegant, until someone tried to investigate. In 1876, a man named Inspector Felix Alden was dispatched from the Poor Law Commission after an anonymous tip claimed excessive nighttime labor at Greystone. Alden arrived on May 3rd. His notebook, found decades later in a sealed wall cavity, details the first 36 hours of his visit. "The children do not look at me. The staff walk in pairs and carry no keys. The chapel has no altar, only a drain. I heard weeping. I followed it to the laundry tunnels. There is another stairwell walled off. That is the final legible entry." Alden never returned to London. His disappearance was chalked up to illness and misadventure. No inquiry followed. His family was told he died of exposure while traveling north. But Sister Magdalene's journal in an earlier passage mentioned a new man in the workhouse for only 2 nights before his boots were found by the chapel door, still laced with the toes pointing inward. What became clear in the years following was that Harrow had eyes in every hall, and none of them blinked. Not the staff, not the priests, not the children, at least not for long. By 1880, Greystone was functionally invisible to the state. It existed entirely within its own moral order, a kingdom beneath stone, ruled by silence. There is no altar, no crucifix, no light from stained glass, only stone water and a smell like rusted teeth. Field notes from Dr. Harold Lem, restoration architect, 1985. From the outside, Greystone's chapel appeared like any other early Victorian religious structure, gray limestone facade, tall, lancet windows bricked over by 1870, and a small steeple that no longer held a bell. But the interior, first documented after partial excavation in 1985, told a different story. There were no pews, no altar, no pulpit, no tabernacle. Instead, the space was dominated by a central stone basin 3 feet wide and carved with a spiral channel that funneled into a floor drain. The basin was stained with layers of what experts believed to be organic residue. Around the perimeter stood 12 columns each, etched with Latin phrases that did not correspond to any known scripture. Translations revealed phrases like silencio ante Deum, be silent before God, sanguis audit blood listens, auris sub terra, an ear beneath the earth. At the far end of the room beneath where the cross should have hung was a trapdoor sealed shut with 6 iron bolts. It would not be opened until 1986 after the structural collapse. What lay beneath would confirm every nightmare. But long before its rediscovery, the chapel had become a source of unease even within the workhouse. Children referred to it only as the Hollow Room. They were led there one by one, barefoot, wearing plain linen. No one ever spoke of what occurred inside, but afterwards they no longer spoke at all. Eleanor Whitcomb, writing in her 1882 notebook, described an event observed through a cracked wall vent while visiting with her uncle, a diocesan treasurer assigned to Greystone. She recalled a girl of about 10 was brought in. She looked bruised, not beaten, just bent like a reed that won't stand. She was told to kneel beside the basin. Warden Harrow stood behind her. Then the door shut. I heard no cries, only the sound of water. Then nothing. The girl, Eleanor later learned, had been admitted for habitual nightmares and difficulty conforming to quiet prayer. Her name was Hannah Rook. She never appeared in any registry again. Perhaps most unsettling was the reconstruction diagram created after the building's partial collapse. When the chapel was unearthed in 1986, workers found the trapdoor fused with age and rust. Inside were the remains of a spiral stair descending into what seemed like a natural cavity. At the bottom of that stair, carved into the wall, was a sentence in Old English, "Daswigan lait feistnian. Isi gehira, tait isi guilt. Let the silent be sealed. I hear, therefore I sin." The walls below were damp with condensation and lined with hooks. We now believe that the chapel at Greystone was not a sanctuary nor even a place of religious instruction. It was a chamber of ritual humiliation, sensory manipulation, and psychological erasure, a final stage in Harrow's doctrine, to silence the soul. They called it a structural failure, but nothing fails that perfectly, that selectively. Sarah Ellen, investigative journalist, 1986. On the morning of May 17, 1986, contractors began restoration work on what remained of Greystone Workhouse's chapel annex, long abandoned, half swallowed by moss and decades of neglect. The goal was to reinforce the exterior shell before repurposing the building as part of a historical trust initiative. By noon, part of the eastern foundation caved in. What collapsed was not an outer wall but a sealed interior chamber buried beneath the chapel, unlisted on any architectural record. 3 workers were injured. The 4th, a man named Oliver Quinn, refused to return underground after being lowered into the breach. When interviewed later, he would only say there were bones, not scattered stacked, aligned. And something was carved in the stone. Not English, not Latin. It looked watched. 2 days later, Sarah Ellen, a rising journalist with the Sheffield Post, was tipped off by a contact within the restoration team. Her interest was immediate and personal. Her grandmother, born in 1871, had once spoken of a place where silence had teeth. Ellen traveled to Greystone on May 21st, camera and recorder in hand. Her published report, released 10 days later, shook the quiet village of Whitmere to its core. Her article described the hidden staircase beneath the chapel, the narrow stone corridor leading to a room lined with rusted manacles, the calcified remains of small children, at least 18 based on initial examination, and most disturbingly, a symbol repeatedly carved into the walls, a spiral nested within a square surrounded by tally marks. Forensic experts could not date the bones precisely, but confirmed the chamber had not been opened in over a century. Sarah Ellen's article beneath Greystone, What Silence Buried was reprinted in major UK newspapers within the week. She received letters, threats, and one anonymous package containing a photograph of a chapel door marked with a red spiral burned into the wood. Then she vanished. Her final known movement was recorded on June 4, 1986. She boarded a late train from London King's Cross, heading north to interview a former Greystone custodian. She never arrived. The train did. Her seat was empty. Her recorder camera and notes were never recovered. The police investigation was brief. Her disappearance was ruled inconclusive. No link was officially made to Greystone. But behind closed doors, the restoration funding was quietly revoked. And within 6 months, the entire workhouse property was sealed under the Historical Displacement and Preservation Act, a rarely invoked clause designed to prevent further excavation. The silence had returned. Her story was never finished. But part of it remains buried in print in photocopied archives and in the voice of one child who survived long enough to remember what was done in the dark. They did not kill the children. Not all of them. Some were returned, but changed. Quiet in ways no prayer could cause. Eleanor Whitcomb, personal letter to Reverend Charles Rook, 1912. After the chapel collapse and Sarah Ellen's disappearance, public interest in Greystone plummeted almost as if by design. But in a locked cabinet at the University of Manchester's Special Collections Department, an archivist named Felicity Moore discovered a set of unlisted boxes in 1994. The contents bore a familiar signature, E.W. The boxes belonged to Eleanor Whitcomb, reformist writer and survivor of Greystone's brief charitable oversight. They contained over 700 pages of handwritten notes, sketches, and correspondences spanning 4 decades. Among them, drawings of the chapel, crude but meticulous. Lists of children's names, some crossed out, others circled. And at the center, a set of transcribed rites labeled The Quiet Rebirth. The rite, according to Eleanor's notes, was performed once per quarter. Always at night. Always following what the staff referred to as a cleansing week, a period during which certain children were isolated, underfed, and deprived of sleep. The selected child, always between ages 6 and 11, would be taken to the chapel basin, stripped of identity clothes, name tags, sometimes hair, and placed in kneeling position facing the spiral drain. 3 staff members dressed in gray wool and waxed gloves would chant in low rhythmic pulses, not in Latin, but in a phonetic dialect Eleanor could not fully identify. She tried to transcribe it phonetically, selnem, selnem. Do not speak, do not dream. Let the breath curl backward. Then a shallow incision on the child's left palm. The blood would be allowed to drip into the basin, and then silence. For 12 full minutes. What happened afterward was never recorded in words, only symbols. A spiral enclosed in a square, a line with no end curling back into itself. A small, headless figure kneeling beneath a sun drawn without rays. Some children were returned to the dormitories the next day, silent, compliant, blank-eyed. Others were never seen again. Of those returned, Eleanor tracked 9 in adulthood. 4 took their lives before the age of 20. 2 were institutionalized for catatonic fugue. 1 disappeared in 1911, last seen near a chapel ruin in Northumberland. The remaining 2 became clergymen, both later excommunicated for ritual deviation and unauthorized doctrine. But perhaps most haunting was Eleanor's inclusion of one final name, Nathaniel Blythe, the boy who drew the garden, the boy who escaped. In a letter dated 1908, Eleanor wrote, Nathaniel visited me today. He is no longer a child, but the silence clings to him still. He never speaks above a whisper. He cannot look at churches, but he remembers. Oh, how he remembers. And what he told me. No chapel should ever be built atop another. What Eleanor feared, what she believed to her final days, was this, that Greystone's chapel was not meant to sanctify. It was meant to erase, to extract obedience, to rewrite identity. to take silence and call it salvation, and the quiet rebirth was not a ritual of faith. It was an experiment in control. They sealed the chapel, yes, but they didn't seal what was beneath it, because they didn't build it. It was already there. Unsent letter, Eleanor Whitcomb, 1922. In the final box recovered from Eleanor's archive buried beneath correspondence and newspaper clippings was a folded sheaf of aged parchment wrapped in oilcloth. It was marked only with wax and a single Latin phrase scrawled in pencil. Non tactus adeo. Sed a liquid vigilat. Not touched by God. But something watches. Inside, a hand-drawn map. The last thing Eleanor ever created. It began with the chapel, the basin, the trapdoor. But unlike official architectural records, Eleanor's map extended farther south beneath the natural slope of Greystone Hill, following what she labeled as the Path of Silence. The map charted a spiral corridor, narrow, uneven, possibly carved by hand or erosion. At the base, she drew a circular chamber with no labels, only the symbol O within, surrounded by 12 short ticks. Around it, in red ink, they called it the navel. No one came back the same. Eleanor's notes suggested that this chamber predated the workhouse itself. She believed the early builders discovered it during construction, and rather than seal it, built atop it, repurposing its psychological effect. It was, she hypothesized, a naturally oppressive place where sound behaved strangely, and even memory was difficult to retain. Her writings describe one childhood encounter she never included in her official reports. I was 11. I followed Sister Agnes down a hallway I had never seen. It sloped slightly, though we were indoors. She carried nothing, just whispered prayers I could not recognize. At the end was a round space with no floor, just stone water and dark. I saw her lips move, but heard no words. My skin ached from the silence, and something felt awake. She was pulled away moments later by another nurse who scolded her for trespassing. But Eleanor never forgot. The shape, the cold, the stillness, and the whisper that didn't enter through her ears, but her spine. In 2002, a team of geoarchaeologists from the University of Leeds was granted rare access to the Greystone site for seismic scanning. No excavation, just subsurface mapping. Their findings, when cross-referenced with Eleanor's hand-drawn map, were nearly identical, a hollow spiral void approximately 22 feet below the former chapel. A central chamber roughly 7 meters wide with an unusually low acoustic response, as if sound disappeared entirely. And beneath that, bedrock disruption suggesting a second void, deeper unmapped. They were denied permission to drill. 3 months later, funding was pulled. The lead investigator, Dr. Rosalind Vane, left the university citing personal distress and was later treated for auditory hallucinations and insomnia. Her final published note, "Whatever is beneath Greystone, it does not want to be named." Eleanor never mailed her final letter. It was addressed to Father Charles Rook, a distant cousin of Hannah Rook, the girl she once saw led into the chapel. In it, she wrote, "I do not know what they called it. I only know what I felt. We tried to name it faith. We tried to make it doctrine, but it was neither. It was hunger. He was always quiet, but not the peaceful kind. His silence was brittle. Like if you touched it, it would shatter and cut." Isabel Cormer, nurse, 1939. In the spring of 1947, a man named Nathaniel Blythe checked himself into Rotham County Sanatorium under the name J. North. He was 65 years old, unmarried, with no known relatives, and no medical records after 1891. He brought with him only 2 items, a worn leather journal with no words, only drawings, and a sealed envelope marked, "If someone ever asks about Greystone, give them this." That envelope would not be opened until 1973. The nurse assigned to him, Isabel Cormer, described him as alert but deeply withdrawn. He would often sit motionless for hours, staring not into space but downward, as if through the floor. One evening, during a rare thunderstorm, he spoke. Not much, just a sentence. But it was enough. They asked me to close my eyes. I didn't. I watched them open the earth. After his death that winter, the sealed envelope was turned over to hospital administration. It would languish in a filing cabinet for nearly 3 decades until a researcher Dr. Miles Corwin, reviewing unclaimed estates, found the name Nathaniel Blythe tied to a long-defunct entry in Greystone's 1881 admittance log. Corwin pushed for release of the envelope. Inside, a single audio reel dated 1947, a torn page from a child's sketchbook, and a message handwritten in block letters, "Do not translate the song." The reel contained 12 minutes of audio. The speaker was male, older, and raspy but clear. The following is a partial transcript verified and digitized in 2003 by the British Oral History Archive. They called it a rebirth, said I'd see angels, but angels don't pull you by the teeth. Angels don't whisper numbers in your ear until your bones ache. There were stairs, yes, but not normal. They went down too long. The air turned thick like breathing through wool, and I knew if I screamed, no one would hear. At the bottom was a room made of round stone, cold water on the floor. They made me kneel. Then she started singing. The woman had no name. She wore gray. Her eyes were shut, but she moved like she could see. Her song, it wasn't a lullaby, it was a loop, a spiral made of sound. I remember it more in my bones than my ears. When it was over, they left me there. I don't remember climbing back. I just remember waking in the dormitory, my mouth full of salt, and a spiral burned into my palm. The song he referenced was partially hummed on the reel, a 6-note sequence repeated irregularly. When the audio was played at the University of Sussex in 2006, one technician reported nausea. Another claimed temporary aphasia. The reel was pulled from public access in 2007, but the sketch inside the envelope may have been more disturbing. Drawn in graphite and ash, it depicted a circular room with a narrow slit in the ceiling. Inside, a kneeling child. Around them, 12 adults, faceless hands raised. Above, a phrase, written backward, mirrored from the inside out, "Your body is not your own." Nathaniel Blythe was the only confirmed survivor of a full spiral ritual. He never married, never published, never described the voice of the woman in gray. But in the final line of his journal, scrawled beneath the sketch of the spiral, was a sentence repeated 3 times. "If you hear it, don't follow it. If you hear it, don't follow it. If you hear it, don't follow it." We weren't there to prove anything. We were just told to document structural stability, but what we saw, it didn't shift. It waited. Thomas Marin, Electrical Technician, Greystone Team, 1987. In October 1987, a private historical preservation firm, Colgrave & Sons, was contracted to assess Greystone's viability for public opening as a heritage learning site. The firm sent a 5-man crew, including a Geotech 2 civil engineers, a lighting technician, and an archivist observer. Their goal: inspect sub-basement 3, the level beneath the original chapel. Eleanor's maps had hinted at a deeper chamber, but no official blueprint confirmed its existence. They assumed the worst they'd find was rot or cave-in. They were wrong. On October 14th, a single slab of marble was found beneath a thin dirt layer in the chapel ruins. It was square 4 feet across and slightly warm to the touch. One of the engineers, Alan Frey, noted it had no seam, no grout, as if poured in place by something far older than cement. Inscribed faintly on its surface, motives tacit. Let movement fall silent. There was debate about whether to disturb it, but the project lead, Edmund Cole, insisted on opening it for full inspection. His reasoning was clear in the transcript. We can't preserve what we don't understand, and the worst thing buried is doubt. October 15th, 6:42 a.m., the slab was lifted. Below it, a vertical shaft descending roughly 18 feet, ending in packed soil and curved granite. And along the walls, something unexpected, grooves like finger marks, tracing downward, not carved, but worn in, as if something had been lowered, or tried to climb out. They rigged a light, lowered a camera. What it captured was a stone floor, water-stained, and etched with the same spiral symbol found in Nathaniel's sketch. At the edge of the frame, what appeared to be a handprint darkened not in blood, but soot or ash. Then the footage cut out. Abruptly, the lights in the chamber above flickered, the generator stuttered, and the room temperature dropped 12 degrees in under 30 seconds. When the backup lights activated, the rope they'd used for the camera was taut, stretched inward as if pulled. The shaft was sealed immediately. The footage recovered just 41 seconds was analyzed by the University of Bristol's Digital Forensics Lab. Frame by frame near the 0:39 mark, a flicker of movement. A shape thin, human-sized, rising from a crouch. Its limbs disjointed, bending unnaturally at the joints. No eyes, but a head turned directly toward the lens. And carved across the wall behind it, a phrase in English, "Be still." Of the 5 crewmen, one resigned the next week and entered psychiatric care. One moved to South America and cut all contact with family. 2 refused to speak of the project again. And Edmund Cole, the one who insisted on opening the floor, was found drowned in his bathtub 6 weeks later with no water damage to the bathroom floor and spiral scratches beneath his fingernails. The shaft was resealed with lead-lined concrete. All footage was quietly confiscated by the Diocesan Oversight Board. No public report was issued. And in 1991, Greystone was declared unsafe for visitation and returned to dormant status. But copies of the 41-second reel still exist circulating in archivist circles, always dubbed Never Streamed. They say if you pause it just right, you can see the spiral pulse. But the smart ones never pause it. It was not consecrated land. They claimed it was because it was easier to lie than to confess fear. Excerpt from the Carrick Letter, 1813. In June of 2005, restoration workers at St. Ethelstan's Church, a crumbling Anglican parish in Carrick-on-Firth, uncovered a sealed tin box buried behind the altar. The church had been deconsecrated since 1962 and scheduled for demolition. Inside the box, a folded linen handkerchief rotted to near powder, a scrap of parchment with a spiral symbol drawn in dried wax, and a letter dated March 14, 1813, signed by a man named Father Marin Carrick, the same last name as Thomas Marin, the 1987 technician at Greystone. Coincidence or lineage? The letter was addressed not to a bishop but to a Masonic official in Devon. It begins cordially but quickly turns frantic. The voices have returned, but not in my ears, in the wood, the walls, the light itself. When I preach, the air thickens. When I rest, the spiral spins even with closed eyes. He describes a small crypt beneath the church discovered accidentally during drainage expansion. It was not listed in any plans. He refers to it as the Room of Listening. There is no cross there, no altar, just curved stone and a drain. Father Carrick writes that villagers had long whispered about the land. It had once been a druidic site, then a plague pit, then abandoned entirely for 300 years. In 1779, the church bought it for a discount price, hoping to cleanse it through construction. But the spiral began to appear after the first Mass. It showed in the frost on windows the arrangement of dead leaves, and once carved into the pew by a child who hadn't spoken in years. The most disturbing part of the letter comes near the end. There is something beneath all doctrine deeper than Scripture. I felt it. It wants not worship but arrangement, stillness, repetition. It grows not from belief but from obedience. He claims the hymns of silence he heard would sometimes mimic human voices, often the voices of children. One night, he says the spiral beneath the crypt began to glow faintly. I placed my palm upon it. It was warm. I removed my hand. And the spiral remained branded into my skin, though no burn was felt. He fled Carrick 2 days later. The church remained in use until 1869, when several altar boys disappeared. A local inquiry ruled it natural causes due to winter illness. But 3 separate death certificates listed the same final note: throat closure without bruising, muscles locked mid-breath. In 1891, one of Eleanor Whitcomb's earliest pamphlets, Structures of Control in Faith Institutions, makes a passing mention of St. Ethelstan's not by name but by coordinate. She writes, silence is a ritual all its own. The further back you look, the more the spiral emerges, not as symbol but as instruction. And next to the margin in her handwriting, Greystone is not the beginning, only the echo. Today, the spiral symbol has been cataloged under multiple entries across pagan, pre-Christian, and early ascetic movements, yet none match the precise design used at Greystone and Carrick, a triple-turn spiral closed at the end. Always enclosed in a square, and often paired with the phrase, "Be still, become." It does not speak in words, it speaks in patterns, in repetition, in the trembling between stillness and collapse. Eleanor Whitcomb, undated journal page C, 1953. In the winter of 1953, Eleanor Whitcomb returned to Greystone for the final time. She was 79, her body weakened by a recent stroke, her hands unable to hold a pen for long. She didn't inform the authorities. She didn't request access. She simply arrived hours before dawn with a walking stick, a satchel, and a small audio recorder, an experimental device on loan from a colleague at Oxford. What she recorded is now archived at the British Library's restricted historical audio collection filed as Untitled, 12:43 minutes, Whitcomb E. Here's an excerpt from the transcript beginning 4 minutes in. As Eleanor stands in the overgrown chapel foundation, I'm standing now. The stone is still here. The slab they sealed in 14. I can feel it beneath my feet even with the frost. It's always warm. It always was. I'm not afraid anymore. I thought I would be, but it's like it knows me. It remembers me. She pauses. There's a faint metallic creak, possibly her cane or satchel. I thought the silence was absence, but it's not. It's a kind of waiting, and in that waiting it listens better than we ever did. She then begins describing a sound, not a voice, not music, something else. It isn't audible. It's rhythmic but not mechanical. Like if thought had breath. It's under me now, just beneath the sealed stone. I think it's humming me. We built this place over something that never needed building. We placed children here like offerings. We called it education salvation care, but it only ever wanted obedience. Then, the most disturbing line I used to dream of falling. Not into space, but inward. Spiraling inward into something old. And every time I woke, I'd find my fingernails packed with stone dust. I never left this place, not really. It echoed inside me. It reshaped my silence. My silence was not mine. At 12 minutes, the tape catches an anomaly. A tone, low-sustained, barely perceptible, enters the background. Eleanor's voice wavers. She whispers, "There it is again." Then she stops speaking. Just static. For 30 seconds. Then a final breath. One last sentence. If you hear it, don't answer, but if you do, don't lie. Eleanor Whitcomb died 3 months later. She never published her final notes. The audio was found among her effects labeled simply, "For the ones who still listen." In her final journal entry, she wrote, "I thought I came to expose Greystone, but Greystone exposed me." The silence we buried was never mute. It was merciful. It wasn't buried to be forgotten. It was buried to be contained. Field note, Greystone Restoration Team. June 2019. In the summer of 2019, the nonprofit Restoration Albion initiated a limited archaeological survey of the Greystone ruins, intending to document remaining foundation lines before nearby land development. What began as routine mapping quickly changed when a shallow sonar ping under the eastern wing registered a small cavity less than 1.3 meters below surface. At first, it was assumed to be a collapsed utility pipe, but what they uncovered was a canvas-wrapped satchel fully intact, sealed with twine and wax. Inside was a small laminated tag E. Whitcomb Archive 4B, not for filing. The contents were preserved and catalogued. They included 17 folded pieces of paper, childlike drawings each depicting a spiral sometimes placed over beds, faces or mouths. A lock of hair, gray and thin, bound with red thread. Chemical testing confirmed it belonged to Eleanor herself. A small square of linen stained faintly with what forensic labs confirmed was milk and blood. And one final page in Eleanor's handwriting. They didn't forget. They were taught to unremember. But memory, like the spiral, always finds the center again. We remember in circles. That's how it survives. That's how it waits. The most haunting item, however, came at the bottom of the satchel, a water-damaged sketchbook filled with loose graphite etchings of a circular chamber, the same room Nathaniel once described. But these were more detailed. They showed children kneeling spiral marks above their heads, faceless figures surrounding them. And on the last page, a single sentence written again and again, filling the entire sheet. Stillness is not silence. Stillness is submission. Shortly after this discovery, 3 restoration team members requested removal from the site. One cited a low droning hum that wouldn't stop during excavation. Another claimed her wristwatch began ticking backward during measurement. But the third gave a more direct reason in his written report. There's something under there that wants to be known, and I think we just gave it permission. Since then, no further excavation has been permitted. The satchel's contents were transferred to a controlled archive under the British Heritage Authority, though select items have since been removed from inventory without explanation. But copies of the drawings remain, and in at least 3 of them, researchers have identified markings that perfectly match inscriptions found in other sealed sites across Carrick, Falkirk, and Wells, places unrelated in history but identical in geometry. And now modern historians face a question they once dismissed as folklore. What if Greystone wasn't the only place the ritual was performed? What if it was just one node in something older, wider, and still incomplete? You think it's a location, then you think it's a symbol. Then you realize it's a structure and we're inside it. Claire Holland, Private Correspondence, 2023. In early 2022, a British-American researcher and former investigative officer, Claire Holland, filed a private claim with the UN's Human Rights Council alleging that dozens of child disappearances from the 1800s to the 1950s across England, Ireland, and Canada shared one consistent motif: no grave. No witness, no body. And in several cases, a spiral carved into the floor wall or desk where the child was last seen. Her personal archive included files from Greystone St. Ethelstan's Carrick and 5 Canadian Anglican training homes for Indigenous children. The symbols matched. The phrase recurred in multiple languages: Latin, taxati et fietis. Cree syllabics mastas, ikaun, roughly, be quiet, become. Old English, beon, stille, werthan. All translating roughly to be still, become. Claire's turning point came in Romania in a derelict Orthodox school buried beneath the Carpathians. There, behind a crumbling altar, she found a stone disc set into the ground. Beneath it, the exact same spiral, but inverted. It was dated 1472, and in the margins of a burnt psalter nearby, someone had etched, "We do not worship the silence. We serve it." When she returned to England, Claire cross-referenced birth and burial records across 6 counties, including Falkirk, Greystone, and Wells. In nearly all cases where institutions were shut down for financial irregularities or structural instability, there was an unpublished report of missing children, often labeled runaways. She published her findings in an independent report titled "Concentric Systems: A Pattern of Ritualized Erasure in Commonwealth Institutions, 1780-1950. Within a week, the hosting website was taken down. Her emails were flagged. Her university funding was frozen. Claire now lives in an undisclosed location, but she continues her work privately through encrypted networks. A leaked audio file from March 2024 revealed this haunting statement. There are more spirals. They're still being carved, and in at least 2 sites I found fresh ones. They're not just remembering, they're preparing. And so, Greystone was never the story of one workhouse. It was the story of obedience, of stillness as faith, and the way silence can be used not as absence but as architecture. And the spiral. It was never a warning. It was a map. And somewhere beneath stone, beneath time, beneath words, it continues to turn.